Sign the severance waiver or walk out with zero, Gerald sneered, tossing my termination folder across the polished mahogany desk. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or plead for my 15 years of dedicated service. I simply signed the paper, gathered my brass desk clock, and walked straight out of the corner office. Gerald thought he had just executed a masterclass in corporate restructuring, clearing the way for his 28-year-old nephew to take over my executive salary. He had no idea that within 64 hours, the 4 largest freight container terminals on the East Coast would come to a grinding, multi-million-dollar halt. My name is Howard Vance. At 52 years old, I have spent nearly 3 decades in international freight, port clearance, and intermodal logistics. For the past 15 years, I served as the Senior Supply Chain Systems Architect for Apex Global Freight, formerly known as Transatlantic Logistics. If you have ever seen thousands of steel shipping containers stacked high on ocean, barges, or endless lines of 18-wheelers pulling out of port gates, you know that moving physical cargo is only half the battle. The real magic happens in the digital background, specifically inside the automated commercial environment gateway operated by United States Customs and Border Protection. Back in 2011, when Transatlantic was still a mid-sized regional freight forwarder struggling with customs entry backlogs, the company founder asked me to modernize their entire compliance infrastructure. Every single piece of international cargo landing at American ports must clear customs through an electronic data interchange bridge before a single truck tire can roll past the terminal gates. If your EDI manifest fails or your corporate entry bond lapses by even a fraction of a second, customs inspectors slap an immediate hold on every container tied to your standard carrier alpha code. By 2014, our operational volume was expanding rapidly across 4 key maritime hubs: the Port of Newark in New Jersey, the Port of Charleston in South Carolina, the Port of Norfolk in Virginia, and the Port of Savannah in Georgia. To handle millions of tons of high-value freight, Customs and Border Protection required our firm to post a continuous $5 million customs entry surety bond under Title 19 of the United States Code. At the time, the original owner of Transatlantic was facing a temporary cash flow crunch and couldn't secure the mandatory underwriting. Knowing how vital this expansion was for our clients, I structured a legal solution that saved the firm from financial paralysis. I formed a separate, fully licensed entity called Vance Logistics Compliance, LLC. Through my private firm, I secured the $5 million continuous entry bond, obtained the master SCAC licensing binding, and wrote the custom API code that connect our company's enterprise software directly to federal customs servers. I then leased this proprietary EDI bridge and my personal surety bond coverage back to Transatlantic for a nominal fee of $1 per year. The licensing agreement contained a crystal clear, non-negotiable clause. Section 14F stated that the license was tied directly to my personal employment as Senior Supply Chain Systems Architect. If I ever retired, resigned with notice, or was terminated without unanimous ratification from the Board of Directors, the lease for the EDI software bridge and the personal surety bond coverage would automatically terminate at midnight on the effective date of departure. For over a decade, that legal document sat quietly inside my personal vault while Transatlantic grew into a $140 million global supply chain powerhouse. The stability of our company began to crumble 18 months ago when a private equity firm acquired Transatlantic and rebranded us as Apex Global Freight. The original founder retired to Florida, and the new board installed Gerald Thorne as Vice President of Global Supply Chain Operations. Gerald was 42 years old, wore tailored suits that cost more than my first car, and possessed zero practical knowledge about port logistics. He viewed international freight not as a complex web of maritime laws, customs regulations, and physical infrastructure, but as a spreadsheet of numbers to be sliced and diced for short-term profit. Within 3 months of his arrival, Gerald started trimming what he called redundant operational overhead. He replaced veteran dock managers with cheap contractors, cut equipment maintenance budgets, and constantly boasted about his intention to streamline management. But his real master plan was far more personal. Gerald wanted to bring in his nephew, Troy Thorne. Troy was a 28-year-old business school graduate whose only real experience in supply chain management consisted of managing inventory at a retail clothing store. Yet, Gerald was grooming Troy to take over my department, eyeing my $220,000 annual salary and my operational authority. For 6 months, I watched Troy parade around the corporate headquarters in Newark like he owned the place. He was given the title of Assistant Director of Port Operations, despite not knowing the difference between a bill of lading and a hazmat manifest. Gerald began stripping away my day-to-day responsibilities, reassigning major accounts to Troy, and excluding me from strategic planning sessions. Whenever I tried to explain the delicate technical balance of our port operations or the strict customs compliance protocols required under federal law, Gerald would wave his hand dismissively and tell me that old-school freight guys like me were stuck in the past. The final straw came on a rainy Friday afternoon in late October. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the monthly compliance reports for our European automotive contracts, when Gerald walked into my office without knocking. He didn't sit down. He tossed a thick red folder onto my desk, slapped his palms on the mahogany wood, and looked down at me with a triumphant smirk. He announced that effective immediately, my position as Senior Supply Chain Systems Architect was abolished under a corporate restructuring initiative, and that Troy would be assuming leadership of the restructured logistics division. "We are streamlining executive operations, Howard," Gerald said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The industry has evolved, and frankly, your legacy methods are holding Apex back. Troy has fresh ideas, digital agility, and a modern vision for our supply chain network. We don't need a high-salaried dinosaur sitting in an office managing legacy systems." Standing right behind Gerald in the doorway was Troy, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a smug grin. He didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. He just leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms like he had just won a prize fight. Gerald opened the folder and pointed to a single sheet of paper. "This is your termination agreement. We are offering you 2 weeks of severance pay as a courtesy, provided you sign this general release right now. It waives all future claims, forfeits any rights to company intellectual property, and bars you from contacting any of our shipping clients. Sign it, pack your desk, and security will escort you to the parking lot." I looked down at the paper. 2 weeks of severance after 15 years of building the entire back-end infrastructure that generated $140 million in annual revenue. Under my original executive contract approved by the founding board, a proper termination without cause required 24 months of salary continuation, totaling $440,000. But Gerald thought he could intimidate me into signing away my rights on the spot. He assumed I was a broken, aging employee who would panic at the prospect of losing my job. "I won't be signing this severance waiver, Gerald," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly even. Gerald's smile vanished, replaced by an ugly flush of anger. "You don't have a choice, Howard. If you don't sign it right now, you walk out of here with zero. No severance, no recommendations, and no payout for unused vacation time. I'll make sure your name is mud in every logistics firm from Baltimore to Jacksonville." "That is fine," I replied. "I accept my termination. Please provide me with my official written notice of discharge signed by you as vice president." Gerald smirked, convinced he had won. He scribbled his signature on the formal discharge notice, stamped it with the corporate seal, and handed it to me. "Your trash is out of my office, Howard. You have 20 minutes to clean out your desk before IT revokes your system access." "Understood," I said. I picked up the formal termination notice, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my leather briefcase. I didn't yell, I didn't slam doors. I simply stood up, pulled my brass desk clock from the corner, and carefully packed my personal reference manuals and framed compliance certificates into a small cardboard box. Troy watched me pack, chuckling under his breath. "Don't worry about the systems, old man," Troy chimed in, tossing a metal key ring in his hand. "I'll handle the port databases on Monday. How hard can it be?" I looked at Troy, gave him a faint nod, and said nothing. He had no idea that he was standing on the deck of a ship whose engines were about to be disconnected from the helm. At 4:45 on Friday afternoon, I walked down the quiet hallway toward the secure server room on the second floor. My keycard still had 15 minutes of validity before the automated security protocol locked me out. I swiped into the climate-controlled server room, where rows of black server racks hummed softly in the blue light. I walked over to Racks 04, which housed our primary edge routers and hardware security modules, plugging my secure administrator laptop into the local management port. I accessed the central gateway configuration for Vance Logistics Compliance LLC. I wasn't destroying company data. I wasn't deleting code, planting viruses, or doing anything illegal. I was simply executing the explicit terms of my personal licensing contract and federal regulations. First, I initiated the formal revocation of the proprietary API tokens that allowed Apex's enterprise software to interface with my custom EDI bridge. Without those tokens, their internal database could no longer transmit electronic cargo manifests to custom servers. Second, I logged directly into the United States Customs and Border Protection ACE portal using my individual credentials as the registered bond principal for Vance Logistics Compliance LLC. Under Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 113.27, a surety bond principal has the absolute legal right to withdraw financial backing and terminate entry coverage upon formal separation from a corporate operator. I uploaded Gerald's signed termination notice as legal proof of my discharge, revoking Apex's authorization to clear freight under my $5 million continuous entry bond. I set the formal revocation timestamp to take effect precisely at 12:01 a.m. on Monday morning. When the revocation timer hit midnight, every single automated customs entry generated by Apex across the Port of Newark, Port of Charleston, Port of Norfolk, and Port of Savannah would be instantly rejected by federal customs servers. I unplugged my laptop, cleared my local terminal session, and walked back out into the main lobby. At exactly 5 o'clock, the front desk security guard politely asked for my access badge. I handed it over, walked out through the glass doors, and stepped into the cool October rain. As I drove home, I turned off my work phone, poured myself a glass of aged bourbon, and prepared for a quiet weekend. On Monday morning, while most corporate executives were rushing through morning traffic with travel mugs in hand, I woke up at 7 o'clock, made a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, and sat out on my back porch listening to the autumn breeze. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't checking my smartphone for midnight port alerts or monitoring international container vessel arrivals. Unbeknownst to the executive team at Apex Global Freight, the storm had already hit the East Coast shipping lane 6 hours earlier. At midnight, federal customs servers processed my automated revocation notice. The moment the calendar turned to Monday, Apex's primary SCAC identification code was flagged in the national CBP database as non-compliant due to the immediate withdrawal of the underlying $5 million continuous entry bond. Simultaneously, the custom EDI API bridge running on our servers ceased handshaking with internal dispatch databases. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the first shift of longshoremen and intermodal truck drivers arrived at the Port Newark Container Terminal in New Jersey. A convoy of 300 semi-trucks lined up outside Gate 4, waiting to haul imported automotive components, industrial machinery, and consumer electronics to distribution centers across the Midwest. The first truck driver pulled up to the automated entry kiosk, inserted his TWIC card, and scanned the electronic bill of lading for a 40-foot ocean container. The terminal screen flashed a blinding red banner, "Any rebet. CBP hold Norder Code 704. Indolent in any bond. SCAC revoked." The terminal gate arm remained locked down. The security guard at the gate attempted to manually bypass the system, but the Federal Port Authority database blocked the override. Behind that first truck, hundreds of 18-wheelers began backing up onto the port access roads. Within 2 hours, the gridlock spilled out of the port complex and extended 12 miles down the New Jersey Turnpike. The exact same catastrophic scene was unfolding simultaneously at 3 other major maritime hubs. At the Port of Charleston in South Carolina, 700 containers carrying critical engine parts for a major European automobile manufacturing plant were frozen on the docks. At the Port of Norfolk and the Port of Savannah, Ocean carriers refused to unload incoming container ships because Apex had no valid customs bond on file to take legal custody of the freight. At 7:30 a.m., Troy Thorne walked into Apex headquarters carrying a latte, feeling like the king of the world. He sat down at my old desk, powered up the master logistics portal, and tried to process the morning's container release manifest. A giant error dialog box popped up across his monitor. EDI gateway unreachable. License de-integration date expired. Troy tried rebooking the entries manually, but every single attempt was kicked back by the federal portal. Panicking, he called ET, but the network engineers informed him that the EDI bridge wasn't an internal company tool. It was a proprietary system hosted by an external entity called Advanced Logistics Compliance, LLC, and the access tokens had been revoked. By 8:15 a.m., Gerald's office phone began ringing off the hook. The first call came from the executive director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. He informed Gerald that Apex freight trucks were blocking 3 major port terminals, creating a regional traffic crisis, and that the Port Authority was imposing an immediate penalty of $50,000 per hour for gate obstruction. The second call came from the vice president of logistics for a German automotive giant that operated a major assembly facility in South Carolina. Under their Incoterms 2020 Delivered Duty Paid contract, Apex was legally bound to deliver engine components to the factory floor by 9 a.m. The plant manager warned Gerald that if the assembly line was forced to shut down due to missing parts, Apex would be held liable for $250,000 for every hour of downtime. By 9 o'clock, the financial numbers were spiraling out of control. Over 1,800 containers, owned or managed by Apex, were stranded across the 4 ports. Port terminal operators immediately began charging standard demurrage and container holding fees of $2,300 per container per day. Combined with port obstruction fines and client delay penalties, Apex was burning through $4,200,000 every 24 hours. Gerald slammed his fist onto his desk, screaming at Troy in front of the entire management floor. "Fix it. What do you mean the system is locked? You said you knew how to run this department." Troy was pale, sweating profusely, and trembling as he looked at the computer screen. "I don't know what any of these codes mean, Uncle Gerald. The system says our federal customs bond doesn't exist anymore. It says the principal owner, Howard Vance, revoked the financial guarantee." Gerald's face turned white. For the first time, he realized that he hadn't just fired an old employee. He had unplugged the life support system of a $140 million logistics firm. By 10:30 on Monday morning, I was sitting in my living room reading a historical biography when my personal cell phone began ringing. It was Gerald's mobile number. I let it go straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, the work numbers for Troy, the HR director, and 3 corporate vice presidents started flashing on my screen in rapid succession. Within 2 hours, I had received 84 missed calls and 36 urgent text messages. Gerald's messages shifted rapidly from aggressive demands to desperate pleas. "Howard, call me immediately. This is an operational emergency. Howard, you need to turn the EDI bridge back on. You're interfering with corporate operations. Howard, please answer. We can talk about a consulting fee. Just pick up." I didn't respond to a single message. I knew that in corporate negotiations, the person who panics first loses all leverage. And Gerald was in full-blown meltdown mode. At 11:45 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes pulled up into my driveway, splashing through the rain puddles. Gerald stepped out of the car, looking completely unhinged. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit jacket was soaked with rain. He practically ran up my front steps and began pounding on my wooden front door. I walked to the door, unlocked it calmly, and opened it just wide enough to stand in the doorway. "Howard," Gerald gasped, catching his breath. "Thank God you're home. We have a catastrophic system failure at the ports. None of our freight can clear customs. The entire East Coast operation is frozen." "I am retired, Gerald," I said calmly, leaning against the doorframe with my hands in my pockets. "As you pointed out on Friday afternoon, I am a legacy dinosaur whose methods are holding Apex back. You replaced me with Troy. Surely your modern digital director can handle a simple customs manifest." Gerald's face contorted in humiliation and rage. Don't play games with me. Howard, we know what you did. You sabotaged the IT gateway and pulled down the company's customs bond. That is corporate sabotage, and I will have legal counsel sue you for every penny you own. I will call the federal prosecutors and have you indicted for computer fraud. I leaned forward slightly, looking Gerald straight in the eyes without a trace of fear. Careful, Gerald. You are throwing around legal terms you clearly don't understand. First, I didn't sabotage anything. I simply accessed my personal entity, Vance Logistic Compliance LLC, and exercised my statutory right under Title 19 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 11327, to withdraw my personal financial surety bond. I pulled a crisp paper document from my inside jacket pocket and unfolded it. Second, under Section 14F of the 2014 Licensing Agreement, which your private equity owners inherited when they bought Transatlantic. My personal bond coverage and proprietary EDI bridge were leased to the firm under a revocable license tied exclusively to my active employment. The contract explicitly states that if I am terminated without cause or without unanimous board ratification, the license terminates automatically at midnight. I held up the paper, and right here is the formal discharge notice, signed by you as vice president on Friday afternoon at 4:30 p.m. You terminated me without board authorization. You severed the legal tie that allowed Apex to use my personal $5 million financial guarantee. Gerald stared at the signed termination paper as if it were a poisonous snake. He realized in an instant that he had signed his own professional death warrant. By firing me to promote his nephew, Gerald had personally triggered the contractual clause that shut down the firm's entire logistics empire. You can call your corporate lawyers, Gerald, I continued smoothly. In fact, I encourage you to do so. Because when they read Section 14F, they will inform the board of directors that you single-handedly wiped out $4.2 million today by breaching a federal compliance contract to engage in gross nepotism. Gerald swallowed hard, his posture collapsing. The arrogance that he had displayed on Friday was completely gone, replaced by sheer panic. He knew that the board of directors was holding an emergency virtual meeting at 2 o'clock, and the managing partners of the private equity firm were already flying into Newark on a private jet to demand answers. "What do you want, Howard?" Gerald whispered, his voice trembling in the cold rain. "Please. The board will destroy me. The equity partners will sue me for breach of fiduciary duty. What will it take for you to reinstate the customs bond right now?" I looked at Gerald for a long moment, allowing the silence to hang in the air. "My terms are non-negotiable, Gerald," I said firmly. "First, I will not deal with you. I will deal directly with the board of directors. Second, my private entity will sell the proprietary EDI bridge and continuous entry bond assets to Apex for a lump sum buyout fee of $1,440,000. Third, I require full payment of my contractual 24-month severance package totaling $440,000 paid in full today. And fourth," I added, looking him dead in the eye, "I require the immediate, public termination of both you and your nephew Troy for gross incompetence, effective before the market opens tomorrow morning." Gerald stared at me in horror, realizing that I wasn't leaving him a single inch of wriggle room. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Without waiting for a response, I closed my front door, locked it, and went back to my study. At 1:30 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Gerald. It was Victoria Montgomery, the chairwoman of the board of directors for Apex Global. Freight. Victoria was a sharp, pragmatic corporate executive who had led the acquisition team during the private equity buyout. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Howard," Victoria said, her voice clipped and serious, "I am sitting in an emergency meeting with our lead equity partners and our general counsel. Gerald Thorne just presented a wildly incoherent story about system failures and revoked bonds. We have reviewed your 2014 licensing agreement and your formal discharge notice. We need you on a private board call at 2 o'clock. "I will be there, Victoria," I replied. At 2 o'clock sharp, I logged into the secure video conference link. On the screen were 7 board members, the firm's head of legal compliance, and a pale, trembling Gerald Thorne sitting at the end of the executive conference table in Newark. Troy was nowhere to be seen. He had already been ordered off the premises by corporate security. Victoria opened the meeting immediately. Howard, our general counsel has verified that under Section 14F of your licensing contract and Federal Customs Regulations Title 19, the revocation of your personal surety bond was entirely lawful following your termination. Gerald acted completely outside his authority by terminating your employment without board ratification. Right now we have 1,800 containers stranded across 4 ports. Demurrage penalties mounting at $4.2 million a day. And our largest European client is preparing to file a $50 million breach of contract suit. How do we fix this? I shared my screen and presented a concise 4-slide presentation that laid out the exact operational facts. The solution is simple, Victoria, I explained clearly. Apex needs permanent ownership of the EDI custom gateway architecture and a corporate continuous entry bond registered under its own corporate entity. My company, Vance Logistics Compliance LLC, is willing to execute a full asset assignment and license transfer to Apex today. That will permanently resolve the port clearance gridlock within 30 minutes of deployment. And your conditions? Victoria asked, leaning into her camera. The asset transfer price for the software architecture and compliance framework is $1,440,000, I stated. In addition, Apex must honor my original executive contract's severance of $440,000 for wrongful discharge without cause. Total payment, $1,880,000, executed via immediate Fedwire transfer to my business escrow account. I paused, glancing at Gerald on the screen. Furthermore, as a condition of this transfer, the board must immediately terminate Gerald Thorne for cause due to gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty, ensuring he has no further role in managing corporate operations. Victoria didn't even hesitate. She looked around the virtual room at the other board members, all in favor of accepting Mr. Vance's terms and terminating Gerald Thorne for cause. Every single hand on the screen went up instantly. Gerald leaped out of his chair, sputtering excuses. Victoria, you can't do this. I was trying to save payroll costs. I was modernizing the department. Shut up, Gerald, Victoria snapped coldly. Your arrogance and pathetic nepotism have cost this company millions of dollars in a single morning. Security will escort you out of the building immediately. Legal counsel will be filing a civil action against you to recover our demurrage losses. 2 uniformed security guards entered the conference room on camera, gripped Gerald by the arms, and led him away as he shouted incoherently down the hallway. By 3:45 p.m., my bank confirmed the receipt of a $1,880,000 wire transfer in my escrow account. With the funds cleared, I logged back into the Federal ACE Customs portal and executed the digital transfer of the continuous entry bond architecture to Apex's new compliance team. At 4 o'clock, the API bridge re-established communication across all 4 maritime hubs. By 4:30 p.m., the giant electronic gate arms at the Port Newark container terminal began lifting. The red error messages vanished from terminal kiosks, replaced by green clearance approvals. Convoys of intermodal trucks started rolling out of the gates, hauling cargo down the highway once again. The massive gridlock that had paralyzed East Coast freight operations for 10 hours was officially broken. The following morning, Apex issued a formal press release announcing a corporate leadership restructuring, confirming the departure of Gerald Thorne and Troy Thorne, and reassuring international trade partners that customs compliance operations had been fully modernized under new board oversight. As for me, I spent the afternoon sitting on my porch, enjoying the autumn sunshine and watching the leaves fall. At 52 years old, I am fully retired with absolute financial security. Occasionally, former industry colleagues call me to ask for strategic advice on complex customs compliance architectures. I am happy to help at a consulting rate of $500 an hour, paid strictly in advance. When you spend 30 years building the invisible foundations of a multi-million-dollar industry, never let an arrogant executive convince you that you are easily replaceable. Because when a company forgets who holds the keys to its core engine, it only takes one quiet turn of a legal clause to watch their entire empire grind to a halt.